The Lost Generation. Despite taking place over 100 years ago, the Lost Generation shares many similarities with today. Growing up during this time meant facing war, a pandemic, harsh economic conditions, and shifting social norms. World War I was particularly brutal for this generation. Over 70 million people were mobilized, with 8.5 million killed, 21 million wounded, and 2 million dying from disease. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 was equally devastating, with estimates ranging from 17 to 50 million deaths worldwide, and some reports claiming as high as 100 million. Post-war and pandemic economic turmoil led to the Great Depression in the 1930s, resulting in high unemployment, poverty, and a general sense of hopelessness. Popular culture began to rise through early cinema and magazines, providing a distraction from the bleak realities of life. Women gained the right to vote in 1920, and new employment opportunities for unmarried women widened, as many women were left widowed due to the war. This era saw the rise of the flapper, a new type of young woman in popular culture known for being rebellious against previous social norms, featuring a more reckless and party-going attitude. Today, the Lost Generation is remembered for their resilience and ability to survive a harsh and difficult time period. Some say it could provide insight into modern or future time periods. The Greatest Generation. Also known as the World War II generation, the Greatest Generation is remembered for its heroism, technological innovation, and prosperity. Youth during this time grew up with many new inventions becoming popular and normalized, such as the radio, telephone, and automobile. It was a major time period for culture and entertainment in America. Literature, arts, music, and cinema flourished, marking the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood. Gangster films, music films, comedy films, and monster films became extremely popular and gathered massive audiences. This era also saw the advent of comic books, with huge franchises like Superman and Batman beginning. In the music industry, jazz, blues, gospel, folk music, and swing jazz all became large genres. The rise of the radio influenced many Americans, as millions tuned in to listen to President Roosevelt's famous fireside chats and learn about the news in an exciting way. Approximately 16 million Americans served in World War II, with the majority being members of the Greatest Generation. Of these, 38.8% were volunteers, and 61.2% were drafted, serving an average length of 33 months. There were approximately 671,000 casualties in the United States. As of 2023, almost 120,000 of the Americans who served in this war are still alive. The Silent Generation. The Silent Generation grew up with their parents witnessing the fall of Nazism and the rise of a new enemy in the era of communism. As the children of this era came of age after World War II, they faced a devastated social order. The Soviet Union betrayed America's post-war agreements, leading to a global power face-off for the next 50 years. Unlike previous generations who fought to change the system, the Silent Generation was about working within the system, keeping their heads down and working hard. They were heavily influenced by the golden age of radio, the rise of trade unions, the development of transatlantic flight, and the discovery of penicillin during their formative years. Members of the Silent Generation tended to marry and have children young. Their attitude of taking no chances would later be criticized by future, more radical generations such as the baby boomers. Baby boomers. Possibly the most famous modern birth generation, the baby boomers of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were known for their ridiculously high birth rates, with 76 million births taking place during this time period. This was due to a strong post-war economy in which Americans felt confident they could support a large number of children. Boomers influenced the economy as a core marketing demographic for products tied to their age group, from toys to records. Many items previously deemed luxurious, such as laundry machines, dishwashers, refrigerators, and telephones, entered mass production for the average consumer. Technological advances made before, during, and after the war, such as plastics, television, magnetic tape, transistors, integrated circuits, and lasers, played a key role in the tremendous improvements in the typical standard of living. With this extended period of optimism came a cultural rush, especially in the music industry, where artists and bands like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones became extremely popular. However, not everything was sunshine and rainbows. Major political discussions around topics like the sexual revolution, civil rights, nuclear weaponry, ethnocultural diversity, and environmental protection became popular and heavily debated. This generation was more radical, with many people having different perspectives and favoring more left-leaning social causes, strongly opposing existing conservative traditionalist thinking. Many of these major political disagreements resulted in protests that became increasingly violent, especially as the Vietnam War lingered on. The United States slowly became more divided, and government distrust rose in the following generations. Generation X. Often called the latchkey generation, Generation X stems from the children of this generation returning from school to an empty home and needing to use a door key to let themselves in. This was due to an era of free-range parenting, increasing divorce rates, increased maternal participation in the workforce, and widespread availability of childcare options outside the home. Young adults of this time period were dubbed the MTV generation, sometimes characterized as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. The baby boom era of the last generation was met with declining birth rates during this generation, partially due to the birth control pill being introduced in 1960 and abortion being legalized in 1973. However, demographic changes brought by the 1965 Immigration Act partially offset the declining birth rates from Americans already living there and contributed to making Gen X in America more culturally and ethnically diverse than ever before. Gen X music saw many alternative rock, hip-hop, punk, post-punk, and heavy metal bands rise in popularity. Technological innovation boomed during this time period with the rise of home computing manufacturers like Apple, Commodore, and Atari. Video games became a booming industry during the 1970s and 1980s, with arcades becoming widely successful across the country and Nintendo and Atari introducing home consoles. Compared to boomers, Gen Xers were far more educated as enrollment in college was way more popular. Individualism and entrepreneurialism became one of the most defining traits of Gen X, as the collective generation went on to produce Google, Wikipedia, Amazon, and YouTube towards the 90s and early 2000s. Generation Y, Millennials. Millennials were the first generation to grow up with the internet, mobile technology, and social media. They are commonly described as the first global generation, being connected to the entire world. However, they are also described as the unluckiest generation due to their average and slower economic growth since entering the workforce than any other generation in history, as well as being weighed down by student debt and childcare costs. Millennials were born at a time of declining fertility rates around the world and are having fewer children than their predecessors. Young people of the 2010s were often criticized for having less sexual intercourse compared to their predecessors when they were at the same age. In 2010, the unemployment rate in the United States reached a record low at 19%, and these economic difficulties have led to a dramatic increase in youth poverty, unemployment, and a large number of them living with their parents. Millennials are also less likely to be religious than their predecessors, though many identify as spiritual. They experienced 9/11s, which changed American culture and began the war on terrorism. However, it's not all bad for them. Millennials are often characterized for their digital fluency, diverse perspectives, and a strong sense of social consciousness due to being born in a time period where global news and information can be retrieved in seconds. Millennials are very active socially and politically and are not afraid to use their voice. Despite the previously mentioned economic troubles they face, more than 8 in 10 feel confident in their finances, reflecting their generally positive outlook in a more complicated world. Generation Z, Zoomers. Zoomers are not that much different from millennials, but there are some key differences. While millennials were exposed to the internet and smartphones during their formative years and witnessed the entire world change, being forced to adapt to it too quickly, Zoomers were born into it. People born during this time period have grown up with a rise of social justice movements, a vicious new form of American politics with the rise of Donald Trump, the Black Lives Matter protests, a new pandemic, and lockdowns that prevented most of them from experiencing a large part of their high school or college lives. On top of that, there's an ever-growing attention and dopamine economy with apps like YouTube and more recently TikTok, transforming not just how information is consumed, but their algorithms also transforming what information is sent out to the public. Even something as simple and stupid as memes, which were started by millennials as jokes, have become tools to spread and popularize ideas. Individualism defines the Zoomer spirit, as they have once again returned to the entrepreneurial spirit of Gen X. Because of the internet and the freelancing and gig economy, work is transforming how jobs are run. While the pandemic transformed where jobs are run, at home rather than in the office, social media trends influence culture in a much different way than before. Individuals are now just as capable of getting attention as traditional media and the financially backed entertainment industry, leading to jobs like social media content creation and influencers being the most wanted jobs above traditional work. Zoomers also grew up with SpongeBob, which defined culture more than really anything else in the last century. Generation Alpha. Not much is known about what will happen to Generation Alpha, who are currently being raised mostly by millennials, as it's hard to predict what the future will bring. Described by some as the pandemic generation, they experienced everything about the pandemic as young children and are growing up in a world dominated by changes in their education and entertainment due to technology. Many talk about the pandemic of iPad kids, as this generation spends less time with their parents on average than previous generations, instead living independently and self-directed, growing up with a now 20-year-old version of the internet. Many will experience young adulthood in the 2030s and are expected by the United Nations to have an average lifespan of 83 years across the world. Problems that they are predicted to face are mental health issues, misinformation, and polarization, but it's hard to tell what the future will bring for them.